Since Israel's present attack on Gaza began in October 2023, the Palestinian death toll has been highly contested by the Israeli government, its supporters, and their allies. They've been using every trick in the book to cast doubt on or outright deny the number of victims, and to blur the line as much as possible between civilians and combatants in order to imply that the dead actually deserved it. This denial has become so widespread that even some YouTube content meal channels have suddenly started making videos denying the death toll. So in this video, we are going to examine the official Gaza Ministry of Health death toll and compare the way in which the dead are being counted in Gaza to how they have been counted in other similar circumstances. And we'll see that, in a way, the Israeli side is actually right. The death toll is, in all likelihood, highly inaccurate. It's actually a significant undercount, and a more complete picture of just how much of an undercount that it is will likely only be possible to discern many years down the line. Let's begin. This video was made possible thanks to my supporters on Patreon and Ko-fi. If you like it and you'd like to see more like it, consider heading over there and supporting me yourself. How many Jews were killed in the Holocaust? Most people watching this likely have the most common estimate memorized, 6 million. But something that you might not know is that today, after 8 decades of some of the most well-funded and intensive research into identifying the dead ever undertaken for any conflict, massacre, genocide, or any other similar event, still, only 4.8 million Jewish Holocaust victims have actually been identified. This doesn't mean that the 6 million estimate is wrong. Rather, it speaks to the fact that it is an impossible task to positively identify every single victim. So only estimations and extrapolations that go above the number of confirmed identified dead can form a truly complete picture of how many people died in total. So much time has passed, and so much effort has been put into putting names to the numbers, yet there's still upward of 1 million victims for whom no known record has been found, and most of them will sadly probably never be named. The Holocaust is not unique in this respect. It is impossible to positively identify every single victim in events with high amounts of casualties, like genocides or large-scale armed conflicts. The actual death toll is always higher than what any list of actually identified victims could possibly account for. Sometimes a lot higher. This is for a number of reasons. An event like the Holocaust, for example, was carried out during a time of war and widespread chaos, where it was simply impossible to account for all the people who were being killed. It was also carried out against people whose countries were usually occupied by the perpetrators, so they and any records regarding their existence were entirely at their mercy. They were also able to wipe out entire families and communities, leaving no one left to even testify to the existence of many of the victims. The perpetrators also attempted to destroy the evidence of their crimes, complicating things even more. So even after all this time has passed, even after so much research, it would be ridiculous to demand perfect proof regarding every single victim of the Holocaust, or other events in which large amounts of people have been violently killed. Now think about every other conflict, genocide, and other events like that in history. And think about the fact that nowhere near the same level of research into identifying the dead has ever gone into identifying them in any other instance like it has with the Holocaust. Still, around 20% of the people estimated to have died in the Holocaust remain unidentified, and it's probably impossible to ever identify the vast majority of them. What about, say, the Second Congo War, estimated by some to have caused the death of roughly 5.4 million people? You're not going to find a list anywhere of all 5.4 million victims. You'd probably struggle to find a list anywhere of even thousands or hundreds of thousands of victims. The vast majority of them are probably never going to be accounted for, and it would be intensely stupid to demand perfect proof for the number of deaths, rather than to accept the same sorts of estimates and extrapolations that are commonly accepted everywhere else. I started with the example of the Holocaust here for a couple of reasons. 1, to immediately weed out deniers. 2, because it's something that the vast majority of viewers are at least going to have a surface level familiarity with. And 3, because many of the people who are currently denying the death toll in Gaza probably would not appreciate it very much if the same standards for counting the dead that they are attempting to apply to Gaza were applied to the Holocaust. After all, Yad Vashem, the organization that has managed to put together that list of the 4.8 million named Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and which asserts that the total number is 6 million, is itself an Israeli state institution. I wonder if those who work there
feel even an ounce of shame about the fact that their state and its supporters are presently denying the death toll of their assault on Gaza using talking points that could very easily be used to invalidate their own research on the Holocaust. There is clearly a lot of cognitive dissonance that is required for someone who thinks it's okay to say that 6 million died in the Holocaust, even though only 4.8 million have actually been identified, yet to insist that the present official death toll in Gaza of around 40,000 is actually overinflated, even though, unlike the 6 million figure for the Holocaust, it's not an estimate, as it only counts victims who have been positively identified in significantly more rigorous ways than those used by Yad Vashem. The official death toll in Gaza, recorded by the Gaza Ministry of Health, is based on a much higher standard of evidence than what is usually expected of death counts in both active and past conflicts, or other such large-scale mass casualty events, both modern and historic, and especially in those that are still ongoing. Yet it's also been subject to far more scrutiny and doubt than practically any other similar event. In addition, these attempts to instill doubt in the veracity of the death toll are being given significant undue credence in the mainstream. Important world leaders have even openly denied the death toll, and many articles in some of the world's most widely read news outlets have been taking such arguments seriously. In most other cases, this sort of denial would not even be given mainstream attention, and if it did get any mainstream attention, it would surely be negative. Like, have you ever seen, say, a Syrian civil war death toll denier being paid any mind? Or even any significant mainstream discussion on whether the death toll for that conflict is accurate or not? Me neither. I've actually seen the mainstream media repeat for years, with no questions asked whatsoever, the claim that there are 1 million Uyghurs in camps in China, despite the fact that the origin of that number comes from a zero-evidence report by an activist NGO, and that more serious attempts to count the number of people who were imprisoned in Xinjiang, China during this period have only managed to find relatively weak evidence for a number 10 times lower than that, even after many years of investigation. Yet the 1 million figure is still repeated uncritically all the time, including by many of those who deny the death toll in Gaza, as if it's just a known fact. Clearly, there are very different standards being applied here. The Gaza Ministry of Health's official death count primarily includes people who have been confirmed dead in morgues, as in, they literally saw the dead bodies and accounted for them. And this is sometimes supplemented with people who have been reported dead by friends and family. It does not involve any extrapolations or estimations. And that is only violent, conflict-related deaths, by the way. So it doesn't include just everyone who has died in Gaza during this period, nor does it include other deaths that could easily be attributed to Israel, such as people who have died of starvation or disease related to the conditions imposed on Gaza by them. To those who are unfamiliar with the usual methods in which the dead are counted during active conflicts or massacres or what have you, this might not seem exceptional, but this is actually an incredibly high standard of accounting for the dead in such a horrible environment where it is obscenely difficult to do so. Abiding by such unusually high standards is unfortunately a necessity, because Palestinians have nearly the entire developed world and practically all of the mainstream media against them. That much is already abundantly clear, given the unprecedented levels of scrutiny being applied to their death count. So they're held to a much higher, practically impossible standard, yet they still meet it. They have to ensure that they go far beyond the standards of what would usually be accepted for a death count in such a circumstance, to leave all of the powerful countries, institutions, media organizations, etc., who are just itching to jump on whatever little thing they possibly can to deny their suffering, with no reasonable choice but to begrudgingly acknowledge their numbers. The level of scrutiny being applied to these figures is frankly absurd, unlike anything in any ongoing or past similar event that I'm aware of. Normally, nice round ballpark estimates based on extrapolations tend to be readily accepted, and they usually go far beyond simply counting actually identified victims or the number of corpses that have actually been found. I'm in fact not aware of any other instance of conflict like this where there has been anything resembling the same level of rigor and transparency in counting the dead as there has been in Gaza. There's always more than just the official number of identified dead who are unaccounted for, especially while the event is still ongoing. Why don't we look at Ukraine as an example of this? In February 2024, there were around 11,000 civilians who had up until then been positively identified and confirmed to have been killed as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But a year earlier, the chief prosecutor of Ukraine had publicly stated that he estimated that over 100,000 civilians had actually been killed in total, 10 times higher than that confirmed figure. Now you could say that he was just exaggerating, and hey, Perhaps he was. But the spirit of what he's saying there, that there is undoubtedly more dead than just those who have been officially accounted for, is certainly true. But what he said wasn't scrutinized in mainstream media sources in the slightest. For Gaza, however, it seems that there is way more to say about the official death toll, even though it includes no estimations and no extrapolations. Even the tiniest, most inconsequential errors are weaponized for denial. Imagine the furor that would be kicked up if Palestinians said that their actual death toll was 10 times higher. The way that this denialism usually functions is by first insisting that the Gaza Ministry of Health just innately cannot be trusted because it is Hamas. So a civilian organization, according to this argument, should just have everything that it says discarded out of hand because of the governing party of the territory in which it operates. This has some obvious issues, because whether they really are Hamas or not, you still have to actually respond to the list that they have produced on its own merits, rather than just insist that it be ignored based on who is producing it. And their death counts have been proven reliable many times in the past, so there's no logical reason to just discard their work now and assume that they are suddenly making everything up this time. Then, if you aren't entirely convinced by their insistence that you just throw out the death toll entirely based on who produced it, then they move on to demanding that it be discounted because it doesn't meet some impossible standards that they invented specifically for this instance, which they have never applied anywhere else and which are never applied anywhere else. They arbitrarily take issue with the methodology used, presenting it as if there is something just sort of self-evidently wrong with it, without giving their audience any point of comparison for what they think a good example of what acceptable methodology would be. This can only work because most people are unfamiliar with this topic. They have no idea how conflict deaths are usually counted or estimated, so they simply don't know that the actual fact is that the practices being used in Gaza are in reality far above the usual standards. An illustrative example of someone who does this is John Spencer, a pro-Israel propagandist who has become something of a referent recently in the Gaza death toll denial movement. And you don't need to take my word for that. His pinned tweet is a video of Benjamin Netanyahu himself praising him. He's not exactly pretending to be neutral. In this tweet, Spencer confidently asserts that the Gaza Ministry of Health's death toll is not reliable, linking a report by the most unbiased source imaginable to back his assertion up: UK Lawyers for Israel. So on what basis does he insist that it's unreliable? Well, because according to him, it includes the names of the dead taken from media reports and people who have been reported dead by family members through an online form. As I've made clear numerous times already, the practices that he's insisting are unreliable there actually go far above and beyond normal standards for counting conflict dead, and especially normal standards for estimating them, and especially during a still ongoing conflict. To exclude people reported dead in news reports or by family members would mean literally only counting actual corpses that have been cited in person by Ministry of Health staff, a ridiculous standard not demanded of any other party in any other conflict ever. Whatever minor errors might result from a couple of incorrect news reports, or a family jumping the gun and reporting someone who's missing dead when they're actually still alive, will be totally insignificant in the long run, compared to the far higher number of real dead that using additional methods like that will allow them to identify. That said, while it would be fine to do that, the Gaza Ministry of Health doesn't actually use news reports. This is a lie that comes from a mistranslation of a Ministry of Health announcement which in reality said that they had started using non-medical staff, such as public relations and media employees, to help them with searching for, finding, and identifying people's remains. Nothing to do with news reports. And about the family reports, this one is especially egregious. I wonder what Mr. Spencer and the other denialists would think about the fact that the vast majority of Yad Vashem's 4.8 million named Jewish victims of the Holocaust were only identified thanks to the very same sort of reports from family and friends that they denounce as unreliable in the case of Gaza. 2.7 million of them were identified in that way, and to this day, you are able to fill out a form on their website to file such a report, just like you can on the Gaza Ministry of Health's website. Though the Gaza Ministry of Health standards are actually higher still, since they are cross-checked against the present-day Gaza Population Registry database. Will they be telling us about how the number of Holocaust dead is unreliable next? After all, it would only make sense to apply the same standards that they're applying to Gaza, that they claim to neutrally abide by, to every event, right? But of course they won't. They're just going to keep doing what pro-Israel propagandists specialize in, and what I have talked about a lot in my videos about Israeli propaganda on this channel, decontextualization. They rely on the fact that most people have, of course, never stopped to say, I wonder how they count the dead in conflicts, in order to present the practices in Gaza as if they are unacceptable and render the count invalid, when the exact opposite is actually true. This baseless propaganda is then spread far and wide, and reported on by mainstream media outlets as if it's not ridiculous, as well as, of course, being parroted by other stupid and malicious Israel supporters who have no interest in applying even the most basic standard of critical analysis to such assertions, like YouTubers. Now let's talk a bit about the situation on the ground in Gaza, how it affects the Ministry of Health's ability to account for the dead, and what it indicates about the real death counts. Here is a map, based on satellite imagery, of the destruction that Israel has caused in Gaza. You can clearly see that most built-up areas of Gaza, which is where the most people live, have been destroyed. And guess what? This map is from December of 2023. 2 months into the assault. 10 more months have since passed, and undoubtedly, even more of Gaza has since been destroyed. In May 2024, the UN estimated that 370,000 housing units had been damaged or destroyed. That is 70% of all residential dwellings in Gaza, and that was 4 months ago at the time that I record this. For comparison, the notably intense carpet bombing of Germany in World War II only destroyed or damaged around 45% of the housing stock in its major cities. The notion that the Ministry of Health's figures could possibly be overinflated given these facts is pretty self-evidently absurd. Houses are where people live, so damaging and destroying 70% of the housing in a place where more than 2 million people live is very obviously going to kill significantly more than just the 40-odd thousand people who have thus far been included in the Ministry of Health's official count. And Israel knows this too, which is why they have done everything they possibly can to destroy the Palestinians' capacity to count as many of their dead as possible. They have been specifically targeting Gaza's hospitals, and especially the Al-Shifa hospital, which is the most important hospital in the region, and crucially, the headquarters of the Ministry of Health teams that are responsible for counting the dead, as well as the location of the central data centers where the population and death registries are maintained and updated. Or at least it was, until the hospital was attacked and pretty much totally destroyed by Israel. Israel justified its multiple attacks on Al-Shifa with ridiculous claims like, it's a Hamas military base, producing nothing but absurd animated propaganda videos to back up that claim, which they then never even remotely substantiated after they had actually occupied the hospital. It's clear now that their particular obsession with Al-Shifa was in part motivated by the fact that they wanted to impede the Ministry of Health's ability to account for the dead, because their regular reports on the death toll, incomplete as they are, were making Israel look very bad. Hell, even Western media outlets who are usually very friendly to Israel were happy to cite these figures, given the Ministry of Health's long-standing reputation for accuracy. And that was unacceptable for Israel. Countless witnesses state that when Israel raided Al-Shifa hospital in March 2024, Israeli troops checked ID cards and took anyone who they claimed worked for Hamas away for immediate summary execution. In Gaza, Hamas is obviously the governing party, so every single government employee technically works for Hamas, whether they are like a doctor, a bureaucrat, or whatever. They're obviously not militants, but civilians. Nonetheless, the Israelis just immediately executed them. So Israel intentionally targeted the place where the work for counting the dead was carried out, and aside from just completely destroying the hospital and rendering it inoperable, and thus obviously greatly hindering the Ministry of Health's ability to count the dead, they also killed Ministry of Health staff. And now, after that, pro-Israel propaganda insists that the count is unreliable and should just be discarded out of hand. But hey, you know what? It probably is unreliable, because given how much their ability to count the dead has been hampered, it makes no sense to assume that they're suddenly overcounting the dead. It would make way more sense to assume that they are now undercounting them even more than they were before. And this is a trend during active conflicts and also after active conflicts anyway. They are pretty much always undercounts. So given the circumstances and the extremely high standards that are nonetheless being maintained by the Gaza Ministry of Health despite them, their death count should not be treated with any suspicion at all. In fact, it should be treated as an absolute bare minimum. And guess what? There is also very clear, very strong evidence that their death count was already a substantial undercount, even before Israel's ground invasion and their attacks on the Al-Shifa hospital heavily hindered their ability to count the dead. Air Wars, which is a not-for-profit organization which tracks harm to civilians in conflicts globally, scoured social media for evidence of violent deaths in Gaza from October 7th to October 24th. very early into the assault. They were able to find clear evidence of 3,259 civilian deaths in that time period from social media alone. To emphasize the significance of that is clearly not an exhaustive count of the dead. It's just what they were able to find by searching for publicly available social media posts where family or friends of the dead had announced the deaths of their loved ones. Of these 3,259 deaths that they were able to confirm on social media, only 75% of them appeared in the official Gaza Ministry of Health's list of the dead, providing clear evidence that, even before the breakdown in reporting capacity that came months later, there was a substantial amount of dead who were already missing from the official count. This is entirely expected because this is what always happens with casualty counts in such events. An official count that is based solely on counting actual dead bodies and family or friend reports, not based on any sort of estimations or extrapolations, is always going to end up being an undercount, and sometimes very substantially so. There is absolutely no reason to assume that this is not also the case in Gaza, especially given that what I just went over is clear evidence indicating as such. Solely from looking at social media, one tiny organization was able to find more than 700 victims who were at that time missing from the official Gaza Ministry of Health list of the dead. If that was the case back then, when the Ministry of Health was still operating at maximum efficiency, then it's doubtless that Air Wars was really only scratching the surface there. As obviously, every death is not going to just be announced on publicly searchable social media profiles. So the bare minimum estimate for the number of dead in Gaza since October 7th, 2023 should actually not be the Ministry of Health's official death count. It should be the official number plus 25%. Right now, that would be around 51,000 dead in total. And that's a low ball. A significantly higher number of dead who aren't included in the official count is even more likely. Is it 50%, 75%, 100%? 200%? It's impossible to know for sure, and it will likely remain so for a long time yet. But what is most important here is that the idea that the official figures are an overcount is pretty evidently ridiculous. They are in reality certainly an undercount, and the only real question up for honest debate is by how much? Another talking point that these denialists like to use is the claim that the official list hides the fact, according to them, that almost all of the male dead on it are actually Hamas militants. This is part of a strategy that Israel has been using since the beginning of their assault, where they try to blur the line between civilian and combatant to justify the absurdly high civilian death rate in Gaza. The most recently released official list of the dead is sorted by age, so it begins with 14 pages of nothing but babies under 1 year old. In total, 52% of the dead on the list are women and children, and around 4% are elderly, for a total of 56% who are from demographics that are very unlikely to be combatants. And that doesn't mean that the remaining 44% who are so-called military-aged men are combatants either, because as should be obvious, every single adult, non-elderly male is not a combatant. And if they're killing so many women, children, and elderly people, then it's a given that they're also killing a whole lot of civilian men as well, especially because there is a trend in modern conflicts where a significant majority of the civilian deaths are adult males. A good point of comparison to use here is the still ongoing Syrian civil war. A number of different organizations attempt to count the death toll of that conflict. One of the most prominent of these, which is regularly cited in the mainstream media, is the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, whose figures we'll be looking at here. Their death figures seem to lack the same level of transparency that the Gaza Ministry of Health figures have, as I couldn't find anything like the extensive and easy-to-find list of the names of the dead, which are released every couple of months for Gaza. Perhaps they're out there, but if they are, they're not nearly as accessible. They mostly just release numbers without lists of names to correspond to them. Numbers which then tend to be reported on without any question in the Western media, and which I've never really seen anyone question at all actually, despite this comparatively lower level of transparency. Note that I am not questioning the accuracy of these figures in any way. I'm merely comparing the quality of evidence that is provided in these two cases to show how unreasonably high these standards are for Palestinians in comparison. In March 2024, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights released a report stating that they had, up until that point, counted 507,000 named dead, and estimated that there were a further 110,000 dead who they had not been able to identify, providing another example of what I've been saying throughout this video, that there are always more victims who are unaccounted for, and who might never be accounted for. Of this total of 617,000, they state that 164,000 were civilians. That's 26% of the total, with the other 74% being combatants. Already, we can see clearly that the proportion of civilians killed by Israel in Gaza is undoubtedly far higher than those who have been killed in Syria, given that 56% of the dead in Gaza are from groups that are highly unlikely to contain significant numbers of combatants, compared to 26% of the deaths in Syria being of civilians. But the situation in Gaza looks even worse when you consider the proportion of civilian deaths in Syria who were adult males. A whopping 74%. 15% were children compared to 33% in Gaza, and 9% were women compared to 18% in Gaza. This data abides by a wider trend. It's normal for there to be a disproportionate amount of men among the civilian dead, because women and children are more likely to be evacuated first, men are more likely to stay behind for a number of reasons, they are more likely to be a part of rescue operations, and other such endeavors that make them more likely to be in harm's way, and it's also far more likely for civilian men to be killed because they are wrongly assumed to be combatants, or because they are perceived as a threat even when they're known to be civilians. All of this indicates very clearly that Israel's targeting in Gaza has been very indiscriminate. And even indiscriminate is being generous, since numbers like these can really only be achieved by intentionally targeting non-combatants. To kill such a huge proportion of people from demographics that are so unlikely to be combatants, such as women, children, and the elderly, really requires an intention to do so. And with that in mind, the pro-Israeli talking point that all or most of the male civilians who have been killed were actually combatants falls over. Because if they are killing so many clear civilians from groups like children and women, then it makes no sense to assume that they aren't also killing equally large amounts of male civilians. This can be further confirmed with an analysis of another significant modern conflict, the Bosnian War, which took place between 1991 and 1995. This is a conflict which is widely considered to have involved particular brutality towards civilians, and especially for its particular brutality towards Bosnian women. Estimates of civilian deaths during that war indicate that 22% of the civilian adult victims, children excluded, were women, and 78% were men. 35% of the overall deaths were of civilians, and 65% were of combatants. When combatants and non-combatants are counted together, 92% of the adult dead were men, and 8% were women. So imagine just how much Israel has to be intentionally targeting civilians in Gaza for there to be such a lopsided ratio of women and children among the dead there. In both Syria and Bosnia, the trend is very similar. Around one civilian woman killed for every 4 to 5 civilian men killed. If we were to apply this wider trend to Gaza then, that would indicate that the vast majority of these so-called military-aged men who have been killed there were civilians. It is incredibly notable that even compared to these two other cases, where a disregard for civilian life has been noted, the civilian death rate in Gaza is so high. Even if, for the sake of argument, we assumed that every single so-called military-aged male who has been killed in Gaza was a combatant, which to make clear, they very obviously were not, and that only the dead women, children, and elderly were civilians, then the percentage of civilian dead would still be 56%. Compared to 35% in Bosnia and 26% in Syria. And obviously the actual ratio is far worse because every man in Gaza is obviously not a combatant. Given the patterns from Syria, Bosnia, and other modern conflicts, it would be fair to assume that, if anything, the vast majority of the men killed in Gaza were non-combatants. By the way, Israel and its propagandists have been running a PR campaign claiming that they are actually the most moral army of the world who take every precaution to avoid civilian deaths, because, according to them, the normal civilian death rate in war is actually 90%, something that is very obviously just a lie, which can be easily refuted by just looking at a couple of modern conflicts and looking at what the ratio to civilian and military dead actually is, as I just did here. This claim that it is some sort of average that 90% of war dead are civilians is often repeated as if it is some sort of conventional wisdom. However, there has never been any evidence for it. Back in 2010, the academic Adam Roberts traced the origins of this claim and found that it originates from sources which, based on flimsy evidence, estimated that 90% of the victims of warfare were civilians. Victims in this case not actually meaning dead people, but rather victims of any sort, including people who have been injured, or people who had to flee their homes, or people who suffered some sort of economic loss or damage to their property or something like that as a result of the war. Roberts comes to the same conclusion that I did, that this claim simply has no basis in reality, and that the trend shown in most modern warfare is that significantly more combatants die violent deaths than civilians. And very relevant to this case here, Roberts ends his article noting that people who cite this supposed 9-to-1 civilian to combatant death rate use it not out of concern for civilians, but rather to spread indifference and to cynically justify civilian deaths. Precisely what's being done by those who cite this made-up bogus 9-to-1 ratio to attempt to justify the horrific rate of civilian death in Gaza. The situation in Gaza renders it impossible to fully account for the dead at this time, but the evidence that is available is nonetheless of a far higher quality than what is usually accepted in the mainstream in circumstances like these. And this evidence paints a horrifying picture of indiscriminate attacks, in which an absolute minimum flaw of 41,000 people have thus far been killed, the vast majority of whom were clearly civilians. And the abnormally high rate of clear civilian casualties makes it quite unlikely that this is anything but intentional targeting of civilians. Once the dust settles, once a full account is taken of Israel's crimes, only then will the true extent of the horror that they and their accomplices have inflicted upon Gaza be truly quantifiable. It is something that will take years, possibly even decades, to fully get a grasp of. The actual number of dead is certain to be significantly higher than what the Gaza Ministry of Health has been able to report, and more are still being killed every day. They're being killed while I record this video, they were being killed while I wrote it, they were being killed while I edited it, and if you're watching this while the attack is still ongoing, they're being killed while you watch it. And as always happens in cases like these, some of the victims will remain unidentified, unaccounted for forever, as their bodies will never be found, and none of their family members or friends are left to report them missing. Only estimates will be able to capture the true gravity of what Israel has done, and estimates that go into the hundreds of thousands would not at all be out of line at this point. Given the already high official death toll, the extent of the destruction of civilian infrastructure and dwellings, and the way that similar death counts have evolved in other events of mass killings in the past, including the Holocaust. Now, I want to end this video with one more example, one that I consider to be very important, to provide some insight into how denialism of these events and their death tolls tends to evolve as time passes and things become more clear. A glimpse into the future of what is likely to happen with Gaza death toll denialism as the full picture becomes clearer and the strategies of the denialists evolve. The Srebrenica massacre was perpetrated during the aforementioned war in Bosnia in 1995. Bosnian Serb separatists, supported by the Serbian state, rounded up everyone who they considered to be a man of military age in the vicinity of Srebrenica, then killed them all on the basis that their sex and age made them all combatants. Sounds familiar, right? Initially, the denialists said this massacre never happened. In 1996, though, after the war was over, international investigators were finally able to access the town and begin investigating the crime. After 6 years of investigation, they managed to find the remains of a total of 2,028 people who had been murdered, and they made it clear when they released that information that it was not at all the final toll, just the number of bodies that they had found. Overall estimates of the total number of dead remained far higher, with the most authoritative one at the time being 7,455. The denialists thereafter changed their strategy. They began dishonestly claiming that this report was a confirmation that only 2,000 had been killed, and the Bosnians were lying about the extent of the massacre. They treated this number, which was obviously never meant to be a final toll, as if it was, and they acted as if there were not many more victims still to be uncovered, as if estimates of the total number of dead did not go far higher. Given the fact that the dust had settled, the site had been investigated, and the corpses were piling up, it was no longer tenable for them to keep claiming the massacre had just never happened. So they instead moved on to downplaying the scale of it. With such total denial no longer possible, they also started claiming that even those 2,000 who they were accepting had been killed were actually combatants. They were battle casualties according to them. A lie which was enabled by the fact that most of the victims were men and teenage boys. An argument that might sound very familiar because it is precisely what Israel and its supporters argue. Finally, after decades of effort, more and more bodies kept being found. More and more witnesses, or family, or friends of the victims, were coming forward or being tracked down by investigators to determine who on the list of missing would have been in Srebrenica at the time of the massacre. The list of actually named and identified dead kept growing and growing, from initially being just a few thousand to fulfilling the 7,455 estimate which had been made many years earlier. And then the number kept growing. That estimate turned out to have been quite conservative. Up until today, the bodies of 7,000 victims have been found in and around Srebrenica, and the Srebrenica Genocide Memorial has a stone wall with the names of 8,372 victims inscribed on it. So even in this situation, where a massacre was committed in a relatively small, concentrated area, which makes investigation afterwards a whole lot easier, and which has been significantly investigated for almost 3 decades afterwards, there still remains at least 1,400 victims for which no body has ever been found. The memorial wall ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, because the list is incomplete. In events of this scale, there are always more victims to be found, and some who never will be. Just this year, 30 years later, 14 more victims of the massacre were finally identified, demonstrating that fact quite well. We're only just scratching the surface of the true toll of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Attempts to quantify the massacre are still in the very, very early days. Just like in Srebrenica, the full extent of it can only be approximated long after it's over, and the list of the dead will continue to be added to for many years after that. 41,000 is only the beginning. Though what is less certain is whether the repulsive denialists of this toll will occupy the same place of deserved, widespread derision as their cousins who deny and downplay Srebrenica do today. As the full picture becomes clearer, some of them will attempt to backtrack. They'll try to act like they never denied it. Others will move on to other forms of denial, just like the Srebrenica denialists did. I guarantee you that some of the people who are today saying that you can't trust the Gaza Ministry of Health's death figures will start actually saying that their figures are correct, and that you shouldn't believe the higher estimates that go beyond them, which are undoubtedly going to become more widely accepted as time passes. Just like the denialists did with the initial 2,000 figure in Srebrenica. It goes from, those numbers are a lie, to actually, these new higher numbers are a lie. I prefer those lower numbers now that I previously denied, all combined with a nice dash of, well, they deserved it anyway. It's the same pattern every time. It'll happen here too. Watch out for it. At the end of the day, it is important to understand that these denialists are not, as they like to pretend, concerned with the truth or whatever. They are looking to enable and justify what Israel is doing in Gaza by any means necessary. They know what is really occurring and they want it to continue. And denying the death toll is a part of that. The idea is that if they can convince more people, more governments, and more organizations that fewer Palestinians have actually been killed and that a higher proportion of them deserved it, then it is more likely that Israel's crimes will be accepted as legitimate, making it easier for them to carry them out and avoid any potential consequences. They are engaging in textbook incitement, and while they may never be held accountable in a court, we can try our best to hold them accountable for it nonetheless. Submit deniers of the death toll in Gaza and supporters and deniers of the genocide in general to the Genocide Accountability Archive, which is linked in the description and the comment section of this video. This is a means through which we can make sure that they can't just go back and try to scrub the evidence of what they said and did while it was happening. Once it's over and the full extent of just how disgustingly wrong they are becomes even clearer than it already is. It's crazy, by the way, that many of these people who are doing so much now to try and sow doubt in the death toll in Gaza and to deny the genocide there have for many, many years weaponized this genocide denial label as a thought-terminating cliche against anyone who doesn't just uncritically believe that Western geopolitical enemies are committing genocide-level atrocities when the evidence for that is little to none compared to what there is for Gaza. In those cases, they are very happy to just call something a genocide and to vastly exaggerate the extent of it, despite having seen little to no evidence to back that up. And they act like anyone who does not immediately accept that has committed some sort of unforgivable slight. Yet in the case of Gaza, where the evidence is actually overwhelming, everything suddenly changes. The second that push comes to shove, they become actual genocide deniers themselves. Never let them forget it. That is the end of the video, but don't leave yet because I have another video for you that I think if you like this, you will also like. It is a video from December of 2023 in which I made the legal case with the evidence available up until that point, that Israel had already committed genocide. And given everything that has happened since, let's just say the case is now even stronger. And yeah, so if you like my work and you want to ensure that I can keep making more stuff like this, then subscribe to my channel for more. And you can also support me monetarily on Patreon and Ko-fi, or you can send me a one-time donation on Ko-fi. The sort of content that I make is not exactly lucrative by itself, and it comes with not insignificant risk to me personally, so without my supporters over there, I would not be able to make these videos. Supporters also get some benefits, like early previews of my video essays, and the possibility of getting their names in the credits. Speaking of which, here's the credits for this video. Thank you very much to all of my supporters, and especially my $25 plus supporters: Gel Cribson, Brosnan, Aizmalad, Robocomi, Exos, Qualia, Mlog, Tim Wilworth, Lucian, Jacogora, Geordie, and my $10 plus supporters: Christian Corniels, Can't Care Less, XXXX, Eric Macdans, Ugopnik, Nabiru, B, Johnny Rocket, Firefox42, Happy Nephron, Minijan, Eric Perkins, Ant, Max Halland, Jack Paul, Kieran Goodwin, Megan Lowndes, Soyborn, Comrade Nat Boulay, Clement Fadge, Hector Obregon, Asma B, Support Libraries, Jizdog, Cockled Badger, T Street, and Aramis Goodspiel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.